Chapter 23. The Best Interests of the School. Mrs. Davenport stood up and walked to the front table. Greg couldn't believe how small she looked. Seeing her walking around in a room full of other grown-ups, she only looked about half as big as she did at school. But when she began to talk, Mrs. Davenport seemed larger than life, just like always. She nodded toward Greg and Maura and said, "It was good to hear students from my school speak so clearly and intelligently. And it was good to hear my colleague Mr. Xenotopoulos speak as well. He and I have worked together for over 12 years now, and I have great respect for his talent and his love of the teaching profession. But I feel I must add something to what he said. I did not read comic books when I was a child, and neither did any of my brothers or sisters. Comic books were forbidden at our home. We had plenty of other things to read, but always books, real picture books, and chapter books and novels. My mother felt that comic books were cheap and trashy. Those are her exact words. On long car trips, she read aloud to us, books like Tom Sawyer and Charlotte's Web and the Swiss Family Robinson. Lots and lots of great books. We were not allowed to watch Saturday morning cartoons at my home either. Back then, I thought all of this was unfair. But by the time I reached college, I felt certain that a childhood without comic books and TV cartoons had been better and richer, not poorer. And as an elementary and intermediate school principal for the past 18 years, I have tried to uphold the highest standards of literacy in our libraries and classrooms. But before I go on, I have to make a confession. When I arrived home from school late yesterday afternoon, there was a package waiting for me. I don't know who sent it, because there was no mailing label, no return address. When I opened the box, first I discovered this note. Please take a good look. And under the note, this is what I found. Mrs. Davenport walked back to her chair, leaned over, reached into a box, and then held up a small stack of comic books. Standing in the aisle and facing the audience, she said, "There were 20 or 30 of these in the box. My husband was thrilled because he remembered some of these from when he was a boy. And with some encouragement from him, I sat at home last night and I read comic books for the first time in my life. And here's my confession. I enjoyed myself. Please don't misunderstand me. Nothing will ever convince me that 3 Supermen from Krypton or Donald Duck in Volcano Valley can be called great children's literature. But I am ready to agree that a good comic book can be fun and basically harmless, as Mr. Xenotopoulos said." Greg was almost floating up out of his chair. He'd nudged Maura and whispered, "This is great!" But the principal wasn't done. Mrs. Davenport went back to the microphone and paused to look into the faces of the committee members. "However, I believe we have to think carefully about this question of what gets sold to children at our schools, and especially what children sell to one another. What if a student decides next week that she wants to set up a stand to sell her homemade dolls out by the buses before and after school? Will you give her permission? Or what if a boy decides to bring his baseball card collection to school so he can wheel and deal between classes? Try to imagine all the different things that children could dream up to sell to each other. Do we want our school to turn into a huge flea market? How can we give permission to this plan and then not accept others? As a principal, it is up to me to make sure that my school continues to be a place for learning, not a place for buying and selling." Greg looked around. A lot of people agreed with what Mrs. Davenport had just said. Mr. Z raised his hand. The chairperson nodded at him, and he stood up and said, "I agree with everything Mrs. Davenport is saying. Schools shouldn't become a place that's all about buying and selling. But it's partly about buying and selling, and we can't pretend it's not. Schools are supposed to prepare kids for a happy, successful life. And one important goal of our school system is to turn out graduates who have something of value they can offer to the world. Skills and talents and abilities that others will eventually pay them for. A math teacher gets paid money for teaching math, A principal gets paid money for running a school, and we all hope our students will one day be paid for their work too. So there's certainly nothing wrong with having kids learn about money and economics and profits and percentages. In fact, it would be wrong if we didn't teach them about these things, which is why we teach units on the economy and consumer education. What Greg and Maura have to offer should help other kids enjoy reading, just like the book clubs do. And their comics go a step further because these mini comics will encourage student writing and student artwork. The regular book club companies provide a wholesome service that supports education, and that's why they're allowed to sell books at school and make a profit. And everyone agrees that it's right to get paid for work that's done well. These kids are asking for the same privilege. Plus, they volunteer to donate a percentage of all their profits to the school library, which no book club has offered to do. Mrs. Davenport shook her head. I still have trouble with the idea of actually selling things right at school. But that's already happening, Mr. Z said. He turned to Greg and Maura. How many different companies did we find that are advertising or selling things directly to kids at Ashworth School? Greg said, A lot. Maura nodded and started counting them off on her fingers. There's the Domino's Pizza Day banner in the cafeteria, the Very Fine Juice machine, the Frito-Lay snack machine, the Powerade machine by the gym door, the Coca-Cola scoreboard on the playing field, the Nike book covers on all of our social studies books, the Mars Candy fundraiser posters in the gym, the Wilson and Spalding and Adidas names all over the sports equipment, and the big IBM letters on every clock in every room in the school. Greg said, and there are tons of ads in all the magazines for kids in the school library, plus all the sports biography books that are like ads for pro sports teams or NASCAR. And sometimes there are morning PA announcements about after-school bake sales or Saturday car washes at the high school. And there's the blue sweatshirt with the Champion logo that Mr. Kellett wears during every gym class, and the Apple logo on almost every computer, and then there's the stuff sold at the school store, plus the book clubs. Mr. Z turned to the committee members and said, I don't like the way children are treated as sales targets, and I know none of you do either. But we have to face it. Selling to children is big business, and we have to help kids understand this so they can make good decisions. I did some research, and do you know how much of their own money, American kids in grades kindergarten through 6 spend every year? $13 billion. That's billion with a B. $13 billion of their own money, and that number grows every year. Greg was stunned. $13 billion? A week ago, Greg would have enjoyed that number. He'd have let the number slowly absorb his entire mind. He would have let himself dream of grabbing huge hunks of that $13 billion for himself. But tonight, the number struck him differently. Greg suddenly saw that his giant plan for Chunky Comics was no more than a tiny speck, an almost invisible atom on the edge of a huge, whirling universe of money and products, of buying and selling. Kids spent $13 billion last year, and part of that was by me. Greg kept careful records. He knew that during the past 12 months, he had spent over $400 of his own money, the biggest chunk for a new iPod. Because I'm a sales target, me and every other kid in America. Mr. Z just said so. And sitting there at the front of the meeting room, Greg realized that he'd been thinking of the kids at school the same way, as targets. He was the hunter, and they were his prey. And what did he want from the school committee tonight? A hunting license. He wanted permission to aim his comic books at every kid in the school. And why? Was it to help the kids become better readers? Or to help them get interested in writing and drawing? Not really. Greedy Greg wanted to sell Chunky comics so he could make some money. Mr. Z was still talking. I'm glad that Greg and Maura got to sit through this whole meeting tonight. I'm proud to have them see how much care goes into every detail of what happens in our schools. And I want them to see that this is not us against Mrs. Davenport, because that's not the way it works. We all want the same thing, what's best for the school, and what's best for every student. Greg looked over at Mrs. Davenport, and she was nodding, and Greg felt himself nodding too. Mr. Z said, "This idea that Greg and Maura have, it's not some marketing plan that was drawn up in Los Angeles or Minneapolis or New York. It's homegrown. So I say it deserves our support. And whatever the school committee decides will be all right with me and with Greg and with Maura, but only if it's all right with Mrs. Davenport too, because we're all in this together." Mr. Z sat down, and Mrs. Davenport said, "I want to thank Mr. Xenophilos for that offer to work together on this, and I accept it. And we'll wait to hear the decision of the committee." As Mrs. Davenport stood and walked toward her seat, Maura got up and headed for the back of the room. Greg started to follow, but then he stopped. He turned and faced the committee again. "Could I say something else?" he asked. The chairperson nodded at him, and Greg went to the microphone. He didn't know exactly what he wanted to say, but he was sure of one thing, so that's what he said first. He gulped and said, "If it's okay, I think I want to sort of change my idea." Greg felt the whole room get very quiet. The woman squinted and looked over the top of her glasses at him. "You mean the comic book club? Change it now?" Greg gulped again and said, yes. Because what Mrs. Davenport said is right. It's not fair if Maura and I get special permission to sell our comic books, but then other kids can't sell things they try to make. A man at the front table said, "So, what are you proposing?" Greg said, "Well, I think, really, there ought to be a way, like if we..." Greg heard himself sputtering and stalling, saying nothing, and he knew why. He didn't really have a new idea, but he felt like something needed to change, and he knew it was now or never. From behind him a voice said, "I think Greg's trying to say that the school store could be the answer." Greg turned around, and it was Mr. Z. Greg nodded slowly, and then whipped back to face the school committee. Excited now, he said, "Yeah, that's right, exactly. It's the school store." And making it up as he went along, Greg said, "Because we already have it, a store at school, in the cafeteria. Except, instead of just school supplies, we can sell our comics there. And other kids could sell things there too. Because lots of kids have good ideas, and the store could be like a business, a real business. Except, any kids who sell stuff at the store have to give 50%. 50% of all their profits has to go to something that helps the whole school. Because that way, it'll be half for profit and half for learning. And that's my new idea, if it's okay." Then Greg stood up, turned around, and headed for his seat. As he walked past the principal, he glanced at her face. She was smiling, and he smiled back. And she said, "Just a moment, Greg." She bent over, picked up a small cardboard box, and held it out to him. "The old comic books. I won't be needing these anymore." Greg blushed and started to say something back, but the chairperson was calling for the next speaker. Greg gave the principal an awkward smile, took the box, and hurried back to his chair. As Mrs. Davenport sat down, she couldn't help thinking, "He's really a remarkable boy. I'm proud of him." And as Greg sat down with the box of comics in his lap, he couldn't help thinking, $13 billion.